Marcus had just returned from a long business trip. The airplane had touched down that afternoon, and now he was driving his sleek black car down the quiet, tree-lined streets of his upscale neighborhood. The weather was perfect, the sky a clear blue, and the air was warm but not too hot. Everything felt right in his world. As he turned into the entrance of his gated community, he couldn't help but smile. He had worked hard to get here, and this mansion, nestled at the end of the cul-de-sac, was a symbol of all his sacrifices. As Marcus pulled his car up to the driveway, he could see the huge house in front of him. Its tall windows and modern architecture gleamed under the afternoon sun. He took a deep breath, feeling proud. The house wasn't just a place to live. It represented everything he had built, a testament to years of hard work, late nights, and challenges overcome. He parked his car, got out, and walked toward the front door. The neighborhood was usually quiet, with neighbors greeting each other as they passed. But today, something felt off. As he approached the house, he saw a woman standing at the window of one of the nearby homes, watching him intently. The woman was new to the area, having moved in just a couple of weeks ago. Marcus hadn't had the chance to introduce himself yet, but he had seen her around a few times. She wasn't the friendly type. She seemed distant and always kept to herself. At first, Marcus didn't think much of it. After all, he was used to people noticing him. His success was visible, and not everyone understood how someone like him had made it. But the woman continued to stare, and there was something in her gaze that made him uncomfortable. As he unlocked the door, Marcus glanced over at the woman one last time. She quickly pulled back from the window, disappearing from sight. Marcus thought nothing more of it. He entered his home and set his bags down. He had a long week ahead, catching up on work emails and handling a few personal tasks. But as he stepped inside, something nagged at him. He felt like he was being watched. Just as he was settling into his office to check his emails, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an alert from the neighborhood security app. The app was used to keep everyone informed about any suspicious activity. At first, Marcus didn't think anything of it. But then he saw the message: suspicious individual seen entering mansion on Elm Street. Police have been contacted. His heart skipped a beat. Elm Street? That was where he lived. Marcus frowned, confused. He wasn't sure who would think he was suspicious. He had lived here for years, and while he knew some people in the neighborhood, not everyone was familiar with him. It wasn't uncommon for new people to assume they knew who belonged, but Marcus never imagined he'd be considered suspicious. He quickly checked the app for any details, but it just said the police were already on their way. He sighed, his mind racing. Why would anyone call the cops on him? He had every right to be there. After all, it was his home, his mansion, the result of years of hard work and dedication. But then he realized, maybe to some people, it didn't matter. Maybe they saw him and immediately thought he didn't belong. As he stood up and paced the room, he glanced outside again. The woman from earlier had returned, standing in her yard now, looking directly at him. She didn't even try to hide it. Her arms were crossed as if she were waiting for something to happen. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't sure what was going on, but something about her felt off. He didn't know it yet, but she had already called the police. Meanwhile, the woman Karen, as he would later learn, was standing by her window, watching everything unfold. She had been living in the neighborhood for only a couple of weeks, but already, she had a strong sense of who belonged and who didn't. To her, Marcus didn't look like someone who should live in such a grand house. She couldn't quite place it, but something about his presence bothered her. She had seen him pull up earlier, but instead of just greeting him as a new neighbor, she started to wonder if he was even supposed to be there. Karen had noticed him coming and going a few times but never thought much of it. But today was different. There was something about the way Marcus carried himself, the confident stride and the expensive car, it all felt wrong to her. She hadn't meant to make a big deal of it at first. She had heard stories about the area, about people who didn't quite fit in, but it didn't matter. She needed to know if he really belonged here. And so, after a few minutes of watching him, she decided to act. She quickly grabbed her phone and dialed the police, explaining that a suspicious person was at the mansion. Her voice shook slightly as she reported it, but her tone remained firm. She described him as someone who didn't look like he should be in such a nice neighborhood. The dispatcher asked a few questions, but Karen kept it brief, wanting the officers to act quickly. She didn't want to risk letting him slip away. After hanging up the phone, Karen returned to her window, watching the house carefully, waiting for the officers to arrive. She felt a small sense of satisfaction that she had taken action. After all, if she had been wrong about him, the police would figure it out. But if she was right, she'd be helping the neighborhood stay safe. Back at the mansion, Marcus stood by the window, still unsure of what was going on. He had heard sirens approaching, and the sound only grew louder as they got closer. He turned toward the front of the house and saw the flashing red and blue lights. Confusion settled in his mind. Why was the police showing up at his house? As he stepped outside to see what was happening, a police officer pulled up in front of his mansion, his siren now turned off. The officer stepped out, looking around for a moment before spotting Marcus standing on the porch. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, still unsure of what was happening. "Of course, officer. What's this about?" The officer looked him over, then glanced back at the woman's house. "We received a call about a suspicious person on the property. Can you explain what's going on here?" Marcus felt his heart beat faster as he tried to understand the situation. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He explained who he was and how long he had lived there, but the officer seemed hesitant. It was clear that Karen's call had raised doubts in the officer's mind, too. "Do you mind if I take a look inside?" the officer asked. "Just to verify everything." Marcus was taken aback but nodded. "Of course, officer. But I assure you, everything here is fine." The officer stepped forward as Marcus led him into the house. Neither of them knew it yet, but this encounter was just the beginning of an uncomfortable chapter in both of their lives. The police officer, still unsure about the situation, followed Marcus into the house. The mansion was spacious, with tall windows that let in plenty of sunlight. The walls were decorated with tasteful paintings and photos, each one showing a moment of Marcus's life: family gatherings, moments of success, and peaceful vacations. The officer glanced around, taking in the elegant furniture and the neatness of the place, clearly impressed but still skeptical. Marcus led him to the living room, where they both sat down on the soft, leather couches. The officer didn't speak immediately. He was still processing the information he had received from Karen and trying to make sense of it all. Marcus, on the other hand, was trying his best to remain calm, though the entire situation felt surreal. It was hard for him to understand how this had happened. "I'm not sure why I'm here," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "I've lived in this house for years, and I've never had any problems before." The officer nodded, glancing at the clipboard in his hands. "I understand. We just have to follow up on calls like these. It's our job to make sure everything is in order." Marcus knew the officer was just doing his job, but something about the situation still felt wrong. He had been in and out of his house countless times, always without any issues. Yet, here he was, having to explain himself to a police officer in his own home. It wasn't the first time he'd felt out of place because of how he looked, but it was still frustrating. As the officer continued to ask routine questions Marcus had already answered, he began to wonder who had made the call. His mind immediately went back to the woman, Karen, who had been watching him earlier. He had seen her standing at the window as he pulled into the driveway, and now, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow responsible for this entire situation. It felt personal, even though he didn't know her well enough to say why. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. The officer was still taking notes, but Marcus's thoughts wandered. He thought about his journey, the struggles he had faced to get where he was. He wasn't just some random person who didn't belong here. He had worked hard, made sacrifices, and earned every bit of success that came his way. He had the right to live in this beautiful home, to drive the car he drove, and to enjoy the life he had built. But that didn't mean others always saw it that way. There were always those who would make assumptions based on nothing but their own biases. As the officer asked another question, Marcus's mind snapped back to the present. The officer was asking about his occupation, his background, anything that might help him feel more at ease. But Marcus was getting tired of it. He didn't owe this officer an explanation about his life. He was a law-abiding citizen, and his wealth and success didn't make him any less deserving of respect. The officer finished his questioning and looked up at Marcus. "Well, sir, everything seems fine here," he said, his tone still a little uncertain. "But I'll have to speak with the person who made the call. Just to clear everything up." Marcus nodded, grateful that the officer wasn't pressing any further. "Of course," he replied. "I understand. But please, do let me know if there's anything else I can do to help." The officer stood up, pocketing his notepad and preparing to leave. Marcus followed him to the door, still feeling a bit of frustration bubbling inside him. As the officer stepped out into the yard, Marcus couldn't help but glance over at Karen's house. She was standing by the window again, watching intently. This time, though, she didn't pull back quickly. She seemed to be waiting for something, maybe an apology, or maybe some kind of confirmation that she had been right to be suspicious. As the officer approached Karen's house, Marcus stepped back inside, closing the door softly behind him. He knew there was no point in sticking around to hear what was said. Karen had already made her judgment, and it wasn't likely that anything he did or said would change that. Minutes later, Marcus heard the officer's car pull away. He walked to the window and saw the officer drive down the street, leaving Karen's house behind. The woman was no longer standing at the window. Maybe she had finally realized that she was in the wrong, or maybe she was just trying to avoid further confrontation. Either way, Marcus wasn't in the mood to deal with her right now. He sat back down in his living room and let out a deep breath. This wasn't how he had planned to spend his evening. He had hoped to relax, unwind after his trip, and enjoy the peace of his home. Instead, he had been dragged into an unnecessary confrontation with a neighbor who didn't even know him. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Marcus had faced his share of prejudice over the years. There were people who assumed he couldn't afford the things he had, people who made comments behind his back or treated him with suspicion because of his race. But no matter how many times it happened, it never stopped hurting. He didn't let it show on the outside, but it was always there, like a weight on his chest. He thought about the officer for a moment. The man had seemed nice enough, but he still had that hesitation in his voice when he had arrived at Marcus's door. Marcus wondered if the officer had been influenced by Karen's call, if he had been affected by the same assumptions that often haunted Marcus's life. It was a sobering thought. Marcus shook his head, trying to push the negativity out of his mind. He wasn't going to let this ruin his night. He stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured himself a drink. He needed something to calm his nerves. The glass was cool in his hand, and he took a sip, savoring the warmth that spread through him. As he looked out the window at the neighborhood, he realized that this incident with Karen wasn't going to be the last of its kind. There would always be people who judged him before they got to know him. but that didn't mean he had to let it define him. He had worked too hard for too long to let someone else's ignorance get in the way of his peace of mind. Tonight, Marcus was going to relax, even if it meant ignoring the world outside for a little while. He deserved that much. The next day, Marcus couldn't shake off the events from the previous evening. It had been a restless night, full of tossing and turning, trying to make sense of what had happened. He kept replaying the moment when the officer had shown up at his door and the unsettling feeling that someone, especially Karen, thought he didn't belong in his own home. He had always prided himself on being calm and collected, but this time, something about the whole situation felt different. By morning, the sun was shining brightly, and the air was fresh with the promise of a new day. But for Marcus, it felt like the weight of yesterday was still hanging over him. He decided to go for a run, hoping it would clear his mind. The streets of his neighborhood were quiet, the usual calm broken only by the sound of his footsteps echoing on the pavement. As he jogged along, he couldn't help but wonder about Karen. He didn't know her well, had only exchanged brief pleasantries when they'd crossed paths a couple of times, but her actions had made him question everything. Why had she done it? Why had she called the police? He tried to convince himself that maybe she didn't realize how hurtful it was to make such assumptions. Maybe she was just trying to do what she thought was right, based on what little she knew. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just a mistake. It felt personal. After his run, Marcus showered and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He had a long day ahead, but the first order of business was to talk to James, his neighbor, who had lived next door for years and knew the neighborhood better than anyone. James was the type of person Marcus could always rely on for support. If anyone could shed some light on Karen's behavior, it would be James. James had been the one to vouch for Marcus when the officer arrived. Marcus hadn't even asked him to come over, but James had seen the officer's car and immediately stepped outside to help. He wasn't the type to stay silent, especially when he saw something that didn't sit right with him. James had known Marcus for a long time, ever since he moved into the neighborhood. They had always been good friends, exchanging stories, lending a hand when needed, and even enjoying the occasional barbecue together. Marcus grabbed his phone and dialed James's number, hoping to get some clarity. The phone rang twice before James picked up. "Hey, Marcus," James answered, his voice friendly and warm. "How's everything going?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath before replying. "Not great, to be honest. I've been thinking about yesterday, and I can't help but feel like something's off." James listened quietly, sensing the frustration in his friend's voice. "What happened, man? You're not usually this worked up." Marcus took a pause, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "It's about Karen, my new neighbor. She called the cops on me yesterday. I don't even know her well, but she called the police because she thought I didn't belong here. I can't figure out why she'd do that." James was silent for a moment, and Marcus could practically hear him thinking. Then, James spoke up, his voice a little more serious. "You know, Karen's new to the neighborhood, and honestly, I've heard a lot of talk about her since she moved in. She doesn't exactly make an effort to be friendly with anyone. People have mentioned that she's pretty quick to judge others. But this? Calling the cops? That's something else." Marcus's mind raced as he processed James's words. "Do you think she was just trying to be helpful? Maybe she thought I was some stranger wandering in. But it just feels so off. Like she already decided I didn't belong before even getting to know me." "I can't say for sure, but it sounds like it," James replied. "She doesn't seem like the type to make mistakes like that, not unless she's already made up her mind about someone. That's how she operates. I've seen her around, and she's not one to welcome change. She's kind of stuck in her ways." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. "I can't believe she's like that." I've worked so hard to get here, and now it feels like someone's questioning whether I deserve it. I get it, man, James said sympathetically. People like that are quick to judge, but it doesn't mean you have to let it get to you. You've earned everything you've got, and you don't need anyone's approval to know that. Marcus nodded even though James couldn't see him. He appreciated his friend's words, but the situation still felt like an open wound. I know, but it's hard. I've faced things like this before, being judged, being looked at differently because of who I am. It's one thing when it's strangers, but when it's someone who's supposed to be a neighbor, it just stings. James was quiet for a moment, then spoke again. Look, I get that it's frustrating. But if I were you, I wouldn't just let this slide. It's one thing to assume things based on ignorance, but it's another to take it to the point of involving the police. You've got a right to stand up for yourself, especially if she's causing trouble. Marcus thought about it for a moment. Maybe you're right. I shouldn't just ignore it. But I don't know what I'd even say to her. I don't want to make things worse. Sometimes, all you need is a conversation, James said. You don't have to go in all guns blazing. But if you don't talk to her, it's just going to keep eating at you. You deserve an explanation, and you deserve to have your peace of mind back. Marcus sat back in his chair, staring out the window at the quiet street. He knew James was right. He wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when they affected his sense of belonging. Maybe it was time to face Karen and find out exactly what was going on in her mind. I guess you're right, Marcus said with a sigh. I'll talk to her. But I'm not sure what kind of response I'll get. She seems pretty set in her ways. You'll never know until you try, James replied. And if she doesn't listen, at least you can walk away knowing you did the right thing. Marcus felt a little better after talking to James. He appreciated his friend's perspective. It wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but Marcus knew that if he wanted to clear the air, he had to step up and do it. As he hung up the phone, he realized that this might be the only way to stop the situation from escalating any further. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. Whether Karen realized it or not, it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. The next morning, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something. He had spent the last few hours thinking about the conversation he'd had with James. He knew his friend was right. If he wanted peace, he needed to confront Karen. Ignoring it would only make things worse. But even as he stood up, ready to take the first step toward settling things, there was a part of him that hesitated. What would he even say? How would she react? Marcus didn't know the woman well. He'd seen her walking around the neighborhood, but they hadn't exchanged more than a few polite greetings. He had always been friendly, but Karen seemed like someone who kept to herself, wrapped up in her own world. And yet, she had decided that he didn't belong, that he was a threat. The more he thought about it, the more it bothered him. How could anyone look at him and immediately assume he didn't fit? He shook off the lingering thoughts and grabbed his jacket. It wasn't the kind of conversation he could put off. Today, he would speak to her. As Marcus approached Karen's house, his heart began to race. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he had a feeling it wasn't going to be an easy conversation. Karen's house was quiet, with no signs of movement. He stood in front of her door for a moment, wondering if she was home. The street was peaceful, the kind of quiet that made it feel like the neighborhood was holding its breath. He rang the doorbell, and moments later, Karen appeared at the door. She looked surprised to see him standing there, but it didn't last long. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the sight of him. She probably wasn't used to someone coming to her house, especially not someone like Marcus. "Hi, Karen," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'm Marcus, your neighbor. I wanted to talk to you about yesterday." Karen's expression remained neutral, but her body language told a different story. She stood at the door with her arms crossed, clearly hesitant to invite him inside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched out, thick with tension. Finally, Karen broke the silence. "I'm not sure what there is to talk about," she said, her voice cool. "You've been acting like you belong here, but you don't. I didn't know who you were, and I had to make sure no one was trespassing." Marcus took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "I understand you were worried, but I've lived here for years. This is my home. I don't think I need to prove anything to anyone." Karen shifted on her feet, her face flushing slightly. "You don't get it," she said, her voice rising. "I saw you driving up, and I just knew something was off. You don't look like the kind of person who belongs in a house like that. Not in this neighborhood." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. He had prepared himself for some resistance, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel more real. It wasn't just an assumption, it was a judgment. She didn't know anything about him, yet she had decided, based on his appearance, that he wasn't worthy of the life he had built. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Karen, it doesn't matter what I look like. I've worked hard to get where I am. And this house, this neighborhood, it's my home. It's where I belong." For a moment, Karen didn't say anything. Her eyes flickered to the ground, and she seemed to wrestle with her thoughts. Marcus could see that she was trying to find the right words, but nothing she said could change the reality of the situation. She had already made her mind up. "I didn't mean to upset you," Karen finally said, her tone softer now. "But it's hard to trust people sometimes. I've been through a lot, and I don't always feel safe." Marcus nodded, understanding her fear, even if he didn't agree with her actions. "I get it," he said, his voice gentler. "But you don't need to make assumptions about people just because they're different. Everyone deserves the benefit of the doubt." Karen's gaze met his, and for the first time, there was a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. She looked down at the ground, then back up at him. "I don't know what it is about you. Maybe I was just scared. I've had bad experiences before, and I didn't know who you were. I should have given you a chance to explain before jumping to conclusions." Marcus could see the sincerity in her voice, but he also knew that it didn't erase the hurt her actions had caused. He had every right to feel upset. She had called the police on him without a second thought, without even asking who he was. But he also understood that people's fears often came from places of insecurity and misunderstanding. "I appreciate that," Marcus said, his tone softening. "But next time, before making a judgment, try to get to know the person first. We're neighbors, after all." Karen nodded slowly, her arms dropping to her sides. She looked embarrassed, like she wasn't sure how to make things right. "I'm sorry," she said again, quieter this time. "I didn't mean to make you feel like you didn't belong. I'll try to be better about it." Marcus wasn't sure what to say next. He could tell Karen was trying, but the damage had already been done. The police had been called, and he had been treated like an outsider in his own home. But part of him understood that people like Karen didn't always see the bigger picture. They were too focused on their own assumptions to realize the harm they were causing. "I appreciate your apology," Marcus said, nodding. "But this isn't something that's going to go away overnight. It'll take time for both of us to move past this. But I'm willing to try, if you are." Karen's face softened, and for the first time, she seemed genuinely remorseful. "I'd like that," she said quietly. Marcus smiled, a small, knowing smile. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. It would take time for both of them to build trust. But today, at least, they had taken a step toward understanding each other. As Marcus turned to walk back to his own house, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The conversation hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. Maybe Karen still had a long way to go in understanding the kind of person he was, but today, they had both made progress. A few days passed after Marcus's conversation with Karen. The initial tension between them had faded, but the atmosphere still felt slightly strained whenever their paths crossed in the neighborhood. Marcus had hoped that things would improve quickly, but he understood that change took time. Karen had apologized, and he had accepted it, but it wasn't a quick fix. Trust had to be rebuilt, and both of them had to adjust to the reality that their preconceived notions about each other were now being challenged. Marcus had been busy with work, but he made an effort to keep his head up and not let the incident with Karen drag him down. Every morning, he took his usual walk around the neighborhood to clear his mind. The morning air was always cool and refreshing, and it gave him a sense of calm that he couldn't get anywhere else. It was his time to think and reflect on the events of the past few days. He couldn't help but wonder what Karen was doing. Had the conversation with him made a difference? Was she truly trying to change, or was she just going through the motions? Then, one Saturday morning, Marcus was out in his yard when he saw Karen walking toward him. She wasn't looking at the ground or avoiding eye contact this time. Instead, she was walking toward him with purpose, her steps steady but not rushed. When she reached the edge of his property, she stopped and smiled awkwardly. "Hi, Marcus," Karen said, her voice more tentative than usual. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Marcus put down the rake he had been using to tidy up the garden and stood up straight, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Of course, Karen. What's up?" She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, then took a deep breath before speaking again. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation the other day. And I want to make things right. I realize now that I hurt you, and that wasn't fair. I've been telling myself that I've got to stop making assumptions about people, especially when I don't know them." Marcus could hear the sincerity in her voice, and though he wasn't sure if she fully understood everything, he could tell she was genuinely trying. "I appreciate that, Karen. I know it wasn't easy to admit, and it's not always easy to change. But it's a good start." Karen nodded, looking a little relieved. "I know it's going to take time. But I want you to know I'm working on it. I can't keep going through life thinking that everyone's out to get me or that people don't belong just because they look different." Marcus felt a slight shift inside himself. He had expected a more awkward apology, maybe even one that was half-hearted. But what Karen was saying now made him believe she was serious. Maybe, just maybe, they could move forward. "It's not about being perfect, Karen. We all make mistakes. But what matters is what we do after." She smiled at that, a small but genuine smile. "Thanks for understanding. I know I can't undo what happened, but I can try to do better. And if you're willing, I'd like to start fresh. Maybe we can talk more, get to know each other better." Marcus paused, considering her words. He wasn't sure if they would ever be best friends, but he could appreciate her willingness to try. He had spent so much time trying to prove that he belonged, and now, he realized that there was value in giving others the chance to show who they were too. "I'd like that," Marcus said with a nod. "We don't have to be best friends, but it's nice to know we can at least be civil. And who knows? Maybe we'll find out we have more in common than we think." Karen's face softened, and she took a step back, a look of relief washing over her. "I'd really like that, Marcus. I'm sorry again for how I acted. I'll do better, I promise." Marcus smiled, his hand outstretched. "I believe you. And thank you for coming over today. That means a lot." As Karen walked away, Marcus stood there for a moment, watching her go. He could feel the weight lifting off his shoulders, as if a cloud had passed by. This wasn't a perfect resolution, and maybe things would take time to fully heal, but the first step had been taken. And that, to him, was enough. Over the following weeks, things slowly started to change between Marcus and Karen. They exchanged more pleasantries when they saw each other, and sometimes, they would chat briefly about the weather or what was going on in the neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Karen made an effort to be more open, and Marcus appreciated that. He knew it wasn't easy for her to let go of the assumptions she had held for so long, but she was trying. And that meant something. One afternoon, Marcus came home from work to find a small envelope in his mailbox. It wasn't anything special at first glance, just a simple white envelope with no return address. But when he opened it, he found a handwritten note inside. "Dear Marcus, I've been thinking a lot about how things started between us, and I want to apologize again for my actions. I've taken some time to reflect, and I'm truly sorry for the hurt I caused you. I'm working on being a better neighbor, and I hope we can continue to build a positive relationship moving forward. Thank you for your understanding and patience. Best regards, Karen." Marcus smiled as he read the note. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket. It felt like a small victory, a sign that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. In the weeks that followed, Marcus and Karen continued to grow more comfortable with each other. They didn't have long, in-depth conversations, but there was a mutual understanding now, a quiet respect. Marcus felt like he could finally breathe again in his own neighborhood without the constant weight of suspicion hanging over him. And Karen, slowly but surely, began to let go of her past assumptions. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real. And for Marcus, that was enough. He had faced adversity and come out the other side with his dignity intact. In the end, that's what mattered the most.